The wind howled across the frozen landscape like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone foolish enough to be caught outside without proper shelter. In the remote wilderness of northern Arizona, where the high desert meets the mountains, temperatures had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. It was the kind of cold that could kill within minutes, the kind that turned breath into ice crystals before they could fully leave a person's lungs. Samuel Yazzie pulled his worn coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped out of his small cabin. The Apache man had lived in these mountains for over 50 years, and he knew the signs of a brutal winter storm better than most. His weathered hands, scarred from years of working with wood and stone, gripped the handle of his axe as he made his way toward the woodpile behind his home. The snow crunched beneath his boots with each step, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the frozen morning. Samuel had always been a man of few words, preferring the company of the mountains and trees to that of other people. His neighbors in the small Apache community knew him as someone who kept to himself, emerging only when necessary to trade for supplies or attend important tribal gatherings. Some whispered that he was antisocial, perhaps even unfriendly. But those who knew him better understood that Samuel simply found peace in solitude. As he split wood in the bitter cold, his breath forming thick clouds around his head, Samuel reflected on the path that had brought him to this isolated existence. Years ago, he had worked as a guide for tourists who wanted to experience the authentic wilderness. He had grown tired of their cameras and their superficial appreciation for the land that was sacred to his people. The constant questions about Apache traditions and customs had worn him down, especially when he realized that most visitors were more interested in stereotypes than genuine understanding. The sound of an engine struggling against the cold interrupted his thoughts. Samuel paused, his axe halfway through a piece of pine, and listened carefully. The sound was coming from the direction of the old logging road that wound through the forest about half a mile from his cabin. It was unusual for anyone to be driving on that road during such severe weather. The road was treacherous even in good conditions, with steep drop-offs and sharp turns that could challenge even experienced drivers. Samuel set down his axe and walked to the edge of his property, where he could get a better view of the road below. Through the bare branches of the aspen trees, he could see a small car that had clearly slid off the icy pavement. The vehicle was tilted at an odd angle, its front end buried in a snowdrift against a large boulder. Steam was rising from under the hood, and Samuel could tell that the engine had overheated despite the frigid temperature. His first instinct was to turn away and continue with his work. He had deliberately chosen this remote location to avoid contact with outsiders, and he had no desire to get involved in someone else's problems. The driver had made a foolish decision to travel on such a dangerous road in these conditions, and the consequences were their own responsibility. Samuel had learned long ago that trying to help strangers often led to complications and misunderstandings. But as he watched, the driver's door opened and a figure stumbled out into the snow. Even from a distance, Samuel could see that the person was wearing inadequate clothing for the extreme weather. The figure appeared to be a young woman, and she was moving slowly, clearly affected by the cold. She looked around desperately, probably realizing for the first time just how isolated and dangerous her situation had become. Samuel knew that without proper shelter and warmth, the woman would not survive more than an hour in these conditions. The temperature was continuing to drop as the wind picked up, and the nearest town was over 30 miles away through impassable mountain roads. Even if she tried to walk for help, she would likely collapse from hypothermia long before reaching safety. For a moment, Samuel felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. This was exactly the kind of situation he had tried to avoid by living alone in the mountains. Tourists and city people constantly underestimated the power and danger of the wilderness, expecting that someone would always be there to rescue them when their poor decisions caught up with them. They came to the mountains seeking adventure and Instagram photos, with no real understanding of the respect and preparation that the land demanded. But as he continued to watch the woman struggle through the deep snow, something deeper stirred within him. It was a voice that sounded like his grandmother's, reminding him of the old Apache teachings about compassion and the interconnectedness of all living things. She had often told him that true strength came not from isolation, but from the willingness to help others even when it was difficult or inconvenient. The woman had now walked completely around her car, probably checking for damage and trying to understand her options. Samuel could see that she was shivering violently, and her movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. He recognized the early signs of hypothermia, and he knew that she had very little time before the cold would claim her life. Samuel stood at the edge of his property for several long minutes, wrestling with conflicting emotions and old resentments. Part of him wanted to simply go back to his cabin and pretend he had never seen the stranded woman. Another part of him, the part that had been shaped by Apache traditions and values, reminded him that every life was sacred, and that he had the power to save someone who was in mortal danger. The wind gusted again, carrying with it the sharp scent of snow and the promise of an even more severe storm approaching. Samuel looked up at the darkening sky and realized that this was more than just a simple rescue situation. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and soon even he might be trapped in his cabin for days. If he was going to act, he needed to do it now, before the approaching storm made any movement through the forest impossible. The decision came to Samuel suddenly, like a dam breaking inside his chest. He could not stand by and watch another human being die, regardless of how he felt about outsiders or their poor judgment. His grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, reminding him that the Apache way was to protect life even at personal cost. Without another moment's hesitation, he grabbed his emergency pack from inside the cabin and began making his way down the steep slope toward the crashed car. The journey through the deep snow was treacherous. Samuel had to use his walking stick to probe for hidden rocks and fallen branches that could trip him or twist an ankle. The cold bit through his heavy clothing, and he could feel ice crystals forming in his beard with each breath, but he pressed on, driven by an urgency that grew stronger with each step. He could see that the woman was no longer moving around her car, and that was a very bad sign. When Samuel finally reached the road, he found the woman sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, her head resting against the steering wheel. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint and her breathing was shallow and irregular. She was conscious but barely responsive when he called out to her. Her eyes were unfocused and she seemed confused about where she was and what had happened. "Ma'am," Samuel said gently, kneeling beside the open car door. "My name is Samuel. You've been in an accident, and you're suffering from hypothermia. I need to get you somewhere warm right away or you're going to die." The woman looked at him with glazed eyes, struggling to process his words. "I was driving to Flagstaff," she mumbled through chattering teeth. "GPS said this was a shortcut. Car just started sliding." Her voice trailed off and her eyes began to close again. Samuel knew he had to act fast. He could see that the woman's core body temperature had dropped dangerously low, and she was entering the advanced stages of hypothermia. Her confusion and lethargy were clear indicators that her brain function was being affected by the cold. If he didn't get her warmed up soon, she would lose consciousness completely and potentially slip into a coma. "What's your name?" Samuel asked, gently shaking her shoulder to keep her awake. "Jennifer," she whispered. "Jennifer Morrison. I'm a teacher from Phoenix. I was going to visit my sister for Christmas." Samuel felt a pang of sympathy for this young woman who had simply been trying to reach her family for the holidays. She couldn't have known that the mountain roads would be so dangerous, or that a GPS route that looked reasonable on a screen could become a death trap in severe weather. Her mistake was understandable, even if it had been potentially fatal. "Jennifer, I'm going to help you, but I need you to stay awake and try to walk with me. My cabin is not far from here, and I have a fire and warm clothes waiting. Do you think you can stand up?" Jennifer nodded weakly and allowed Samuel to help her out of the car. But when she tried to put weight on her legs, she immediately collapsed back into the seat. Her muscles were no longer responding properly to signals from her brain, another dangerous sign that the hypothermia was advancing rapidly. Samuel realized that he would have to carry her. At 68 years old, he wasn't sure he had the strength to carry an adult woman up the steep slope to his cabin, especially through deep snow and in such brutal cold. But he had no choice. Leaving her in the car while he went for help would mean certain death, and there was no one else to call even if he had a way to communicate with the outside world. He wrapped Jennifer in his own heavy coat and lifted her into his arms. She was heavier than he had expected, and the initial climb away from the road required all of his strength and concentration. Samuel had to stop every few steps to catch his breath and adjust his grip. The cold was sapping his energy, and he could feel his own body temperature beginning to drop from the exertion and exposure. The climb up the slope was one of the most difficult physical challenges Samuel had faced in years. His legs burned with the effort of breaking trail through the snow while carrying Jennifer's weight. Several times he slipped and nearly fell, which would have been catastrophic for both of them. The wind seemed to grow stronger as they climbed, driving snow and ice into his face and making it difficult to see the path ahead. Jennifer drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes mumbling incoherently about her students or her sister's Christmas dinner. Samuel talked to her constantly, trying to keep her alert and responsive. He told her about the warm fire waiting at his cabin, about the hot soup he would make for her, about anything he could think of that might give her hope and help her hold on a little longer. When they finally reached his cabin, Samuel was exhausted and shivering uncontrollably himself. His hands were so cold that he could barely manipulate the door handle, and he had to set Jennifer down for a moment while he fumbled with his keys. The brief delay terrified him, as he could see that she was becoming increasingly unresponsive. Once inside, Samuel immediately carried Jennifer to the fireplace and laid her down on the thick rug in front of the blazing fire. He had built up the fire before leaving to split wood, and the cabin was wonderfully warm compared to the deadly cold outside. But he knew that warming someone with severe hypothermia had to be done carefully and gradually, or it could cause dangerous heart rhythm problems. Samuel quickly gathered every blanket and sleeping bag he owned, creating a warm cocoon around Jennifer's body. He removed her wet shoes and socks, massaging her feet gently to encourage circulation. Her skin was frighteningly pale and cold to the touch, but he could still detect a pulse, which gave him hope that he had reached her in time. As he worked to warm Jennifer, Samuel found himself praying in Apache, words he hadn't spoken in years flowing naturally from his lips. He asked the spirits of his ancestors to help this young woman survive, to guide his hands and give him the strength to save her life. The prayer seemed to calm his own fears and give him focus as he continued the delicate process of bringing Jennifer back from the edge of death. For the next several hours, Samuel worked tirelessly to save Jennifer's life. He heated water on his wood stove and used warm, damp cloths to gradually raise the temperature of her extremities. He prepared warm broth and managed to get small sips into her mouth when she was conscious enough to swallow. Most importantly, he monitored her breathing and pulse constantly, watching for any signs that her condition was improving or deteriorating. The process was exhausting and nerve-wracking. Samuel had learned basic first aid during his years as a wilderness guide, but treating severe hypothermia was beyond his experience. He was essentially operating on instinct and hope, guided by half-remembered conversations with paramedics and wilderness rescue workers he had met over the years. Every few minutes, he checked Jennifer's pulse and breathing, terrified that he might discover she had slipped away despite his efforts. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Jennifer began to respond. Her breathing became stronger and more regular. The blue tint faded from her lips, replaced by a healthier pink color. Her pulse grew stronger and more stable. Most encouragingly, she began to shiver, which Samuel knew was actually a good sign that her body was starting to generate heat again. As the evening wore on, Jennifer became increasingly conscious and alert. She was confused at first, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Samuel patiently explained what had happened, reassuring her that she was safe and that her car accident had not been her fault. He helped her sit up slowly and gave her more warm broth, pleased to see that her hands were steady enough to hold the cup herself. "You saved my life," Jennifer said softly, her voice still weak but much clearer than it had been hours earlier. "I thought I was going to die in that car. I was so scared and so cold, and I couldn't think straight anymore." Samuel felt embarrassed by her gratitude and tried to deflect her thanks. "Anyone would have done the same thing," he said, but Jennifer shook her head. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have stayed inside where it was warm and safe. You risked your own life to help a complete stranger. Why did you do it?" The question caught Samuel off guard. He had been so focused on the immediate crisis that he hadn't really examined his own motivations. Why had he chosen to help someone he didn't know, especially when he had spent years avoiding contact with outsiders? The answer, when it came to him, was both simple and profound. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "My grandmother taught me that all life is sacred, and that we have a responsibility to help each other when we can. She said that the Creator puts us in each other's paths for a reason, and that turning away from someone in need is like turning away from the Creator himself. Jennifer listened intently, and Samuel could see tears forming in her eyes. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman. Is she still alive? Samuel shook his head. She passed away 15 years ago. But her teachings are still with me, even when I try to forget them. I've been living alone up here for a long time, trying to avoid people and their problems. But today reminded me that isolation isn't the Apache way. We're meant to be connected to each other, to help and support one another. As the night progressed, Samuel learned more about Jennifer and her life in Phoenix. She taught 3rd grade at an inner-city school, working with children from disadvantaged backgrounds. She had chosen to become a teacher because she wanted to make a difference in young lives. Despite the low pay and difficult working conditions, she was driving to Flagstaff to spend Christmas with her sister and her sister's family, bringing presents she had carefully saved to buy throughout the year. Samuel found himself genuinely interested in Jennifer's stories about her students and her work. He was impressed by her dedication and her genuine care for the children she taught. In many ways, she reminded him of his grandmother, who had been a teacher in the Apache community and had always put others' needs before her own. I feel terrible about my car, Jennifer said. It's probably completely ruined and I don't have the money to fix it or replace it. I don't know how I'm going to get home or even how I'm going to get to my sister's house for Christmas. Samuel had been thinking about the same problem. The storm outside was getting worse and it would be days before the roads were passable again. Even then, Jennifer's car would need to be towed out and probably repaired before it could be driven. She was essentially stranded in the mountains with no way to contact the outside world. You'll stay here until the storm passes, Samuel said firmly. I have plenty of food and firewood, and there's a comfortable bed in the back room. Once the weather clears, I'll help you figure out what to do about your car and getting you to your sister's house. Jennifer protested that she didn't want to impose, but Samuel wouldn't hear of it. The forecast he had heard on his battery-powered radio suggested that the storm would last at least 3 days, with continuing cold temperatures and high winds. Attempting to travel during such conditions would be suicidal, and he wasn't about to let Jennifer take any more risks with her life. As they prepared for sleep, Samuel found himself reflecting on the unexpected turn his solitary life had taken. For years he had convinced himself that he was happier alone, that other people only brought complications and disappointments. But having Jennifer in his cabin, sharing stories and conversation by the fireplace reminded him of what he had been missing. Human connection, he realized, was not a burden to be avoided but a gift to be treasured. The wind howled around the cabin throughout the night, rattling the windows and piling snow against the walls. But inside, warmed by the fire and the presence of another human being, Samuel felt more at peace than he had in years. He had chosen compassion over pride, connection over isolation, and in doing so had not only saved Jennifer's life, but had rediscovered something precious in his own. The next morning brought no relief from the storm. Samuel woke to find that snow had drifted nearly to the windows of his cabin, and the wind was still howling with undiminished force. He checked his outdoor thermometer and discovered that the temperature had dropped even further during the night, reaching 45 degrees below zero. It was the kind of weather that could be deadly even for someone properly prepared and equipped. Jennifer had slept well for the first time since her accident, wrapped in warm blankets and finally safe from the brutal cold. When she woke, she seemed much stronger and more like herself. The color had returned to her cheeks and her movements were steady and coordinated. Samuel was relieved to see that she had apparently suffered no lasting damage from her brush with hypothermia. I can't believe how much snow fell overnight, Jennifer said, looking out the window at the transformed landscape. It's beautiful, but also terrifying when you think about how deadly it is out there. Samuel nodded as he prepared breakfast on his wood stove. Mountain weather can change very quickly, and it's always more severe than people expect. The altitude makes everything more extreme. The cold is colder, the wind is stronger, and storms can last much longer than they do in the valleys. As they shared a simple meal of eggs, toast and coffee, Samuel found himself opening up to Jennifer in ways he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. He told her about his childhood on the Apache reservation, about his grandmother's teachings, and about his years working as a wilderness guide. He explained how he had gradually become disillusioned with the tourism industry and had retreated to this isolated cabin to find peace. "But weren't you lonely?" Jennifer asked. I know I could never live alone like this, especially during the winter months. Don't you miss having people to talk to and share experiences with? Samuel considered her question carefully. I thought I preferred being alone. After years of dealing with tourists who didn't really understand or respect the land, I convinced myself that solitude was better. But I think I was just protecting myself from disappointment. It's easier to avoid people than to risk being hurt or misunderstood. Jennifer shared her own stories about the challenges of teaching in an underfunded urban school. She talked about students who came to class hungry, who didn't have warm clothes in winter, who struggled with problems far beyond what 8-year-olds should have to face. Despite the difficulties, her love for teaching and her commitment to her students shone through every word. Sometimes I wonder if I'm really making a difference, she admitted. The problems these kids face are so big and I'm just one person. But then one of them will have a breakthrough moment. Or they'll come back years later to tell me how something I taught them helped them succeed. And I remember why I became a teacher in the first place. Samuel was struck by the parallels between Jennifer's dedication to her students and his grandmother's commitment to the Apache community. Both women had chosen to serve others despite limited resources and challenging circumstances. Both understood that education and compassion could transform lives, even when progress seemed slow and difficult. As the day wore on, the storm continued to rage outside. Samuel used the time to repair some of Jennifer's clothing that had been damaged in the accident, using skills his grandmother had taught him decades earlier. He also began teaching Jennifer some basic wilderness survival techniques, explaining how to read weather signs, how to find shelter, and how to signal for help if she ever found herself in a dangerous situation again. I never realized how much knowledge it takes to live safely in the wilderness, Jennifer said as Samuel demonstrated how to build a proper fire. In the city, we take so many things for granted. Heat, electricity, emergency services that are just a phone call away. Out here, you have to be completely self-sufficient. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing more stories, Jennifer asked Samuel about Apache traditions and beliefs. She was genuinely curious and respectful, asking thoughtful questions rather than seeking exotic details or stereotypical images. Samuel found himself sharing aspects of his culture that he rarely discussed with outsiders, including some of the traditional stories his grandmother had told him as a child. One of the most important Apache values is called NDBATE, Samuel explained. It means the way of the people, and it encompasses how we should treat each other in the natural world. It emphasizes respect, reciprocity, and the understanding that all living things are connected. When I helped you yesterday, I was following NDBATE, even though I had almost forgotten its importance. Jennifer listened intently, and Samuel could see that she truly understood the significance of what he was sharing. It sounds similar to some of the values I try to teach my students, she said. We talk about kindness, about looking out for each other, about understanding that our actions affect other people. I think children naturally understand these concepts, but sometimes adults forget them as we get older and more focused on our own problems. As the second night of the storm approached, Samuel realized that having Jennifer as a guest had fundamentally changed his perspective on his isolated lifestyle. For the first time in years, he was enjoying extended conversation with another person. He appreciated her intelligence, her compassion, and her genuine interest in learning about his culture and experiences. More than that, he was beginning to understand that his self-imposed exile had deprived him of the human connections that gave life meaning. Samuel, Jennifer said as they prepared for sleep, I want you to know that this experience has changed me. Not just the accident and the rescue, but these conversations we've been having. You've reminded me why I became a teacher, and you've helped me see that there are still people in the world who live by principles and values, even when it's difficult. Samuel felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. You've changed my perspective too, he admitted. I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, but you've reminded me of the joy that comes from sharing ideas and experiences with another person. My grandmother always said that wisdom grows when it's shared, and I had forgotten that truth. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, two people from very different worlds had found common ground in their shared humanity. The storm that had brought them together was also giving them time to discover that despite their different backgrounds and life experiences, they were united by common values and a mutual respect that transcended cultural boundaries. On the third day, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind died down to occasional gusts, and the snow changed from the driving blizzard of the previous days to gentle, intermittent flurries. Samuel checked his weather radio and learned that the worst of the storm had passed, though temperatures would remain dangerously low for several more days. The roads would not be passable for at least another day or two, but the immediate crisis was over. Jennifer had spent the morning helping Samuel with various tasks around the cabin, insisting that she wanted to contribute rather than simply being a burden. She proved to be surprisingly capable, quickly learning to maintain the fire, prepare simple meals on the wood stove, and even help with some basic repairs that Samuel had been putting off. Her willingness to work and her positive attitude impressed him greatly. "I should probably try to contact my sister," Jennifer said as they shared lunch. "She must be worried sick. I was supposed to arrive 2 days ago, and she has no way of knowing what happened to me." Samuel nodded, understanding Jennifer's concern for her family. "Once the roads are clear enough for me to get to town, we can call her from there. I don't have a phone here and cell service is non-existent in these mountains, but she'll understand once we explain what happened." As they talked about Jennifer's eventual departure, Samuel found himself experiencing an unexpected sadness. Over the past 3 days, he had grown accustomed to having company, to sharing meals and conversations, to the simple pleasure of another person's presence in his home. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence suddenly seemed less appealing than it had just a week earlier. "Samuel," Jennifer said, seeming to read his thoughts, "I've been thinking about something. You've been living alone up here for years, but I can see that you're happier when you have someone to talk to and share experiences with. Have you ever considered that maybe isolation isn't what you really need?" The question touched on something Samuel had been contemplating himself. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "When I first came up here, I was angry and disappointed with people. I wanted to get away from what I saw as the superficiality and selfishness of the modern world. But you've reminded me that there are still good people out there, people with genuine hearts and noble purposes." Jennifer smiled warmly. "And you've reminded me that there are still people who live by traditional values, who understand the importance of community and mutual support. In the city, it's easy to become cynical, to think that everyone is only interested in themselves. But what you did for me, risking your life for a complete stranger, has restored my faith in human nature." That afternoon, Samuel made a decision that surprised even himself. He asked Jennifer if she would be interested in visiting the Apache community where he had grown up, which was located about an hour's drive from Flagstaff. He explained that there was a cultural center there where traditional crafts and stories were preserved, and he thought she might enjoy learning more about Apache history and culture. "I would love that," Jennifer said enthusiastically. "But are you sure it would be appropriate for me to visit? I don't want to intrude on something that should be private or sacred to your people." Samuel appreciated her sensitivity and respect. "There are parts of our culture that are private, but there are also parts that we're happy to share with people who approach them with genuine interest and respect. I can see that you're someone who would appreciate what you're seeing and learning, not just someone looking for entertainment or exotic experiences." As the day progressed, Samuel found himself making plans that extended far beyond simply getting Jennifer safely to her sister's house. He began thinking about ways to reconnect with his own community, to use his knowledge and experience to help preserve and share Apache traditions with the next generation. Jennifer's passion for teaching had reminded him of the importance of education and cultural transmission. "You know," Samuel said as they watched the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold, "I used to help teach wilderness skills to young people in our community. I stopped doing it when I moved up here, but maybe it's time to start again. There's so much traditional knowledge that's being lost as the older generation passes away." Jennifer's eyes lit up with excitement. "That sounds wonderful. Have you thought about developing a formal curriculum? Maybe even partnering with schools to bring urban kids out to learn about nature and traditional ways of living? I bet there are grants available for that kind of cross-cultural education program." The idea intrigued Samuel. He had never considered the possibility of combining his wilderness expertise with formal education, but Jennifer's suggestion opened up new possibilities he had never imagined. They spent the evening discussing how such a program might work, how traditional Apache knowledge could be shared respectfully with students from different backgrounds, and how environmental education could help young people develop a deeper appreciation for the natural world. "I think my students would be fascinated by what you could teach them," Jennifer said. "Many of them have never been outside the city, never seen snow or mountains, or learned how people lived before modern technology. It could be incredibly meaningful for them to understand that there are different ways of living and different relationships with the land." Samuel felt a growing excitement about the possibilities Jennifer was describing. For years he had felt that his knowledge and skills were going to waste, that he was simply marking time in his isolated cabin. But now he could see a way to honor his grandmother's legacy while also contributing something valuable to the broader community. "There's something else I've been thinking about," Samuel said carefully. "I know you need to get back to Phoenix and your students, but I was wondering if you might consider staying in touch, not just as pen pals, but as collaborators. Maybe we could work together to develop some of these educational ideas we've been discussing." Jennifer's face broke into a broad smile. "I was hoping you would say something like that. I feel like we've started something important here, something that shouldn't end just because the storm is over. I think we could help each other in ways that would benefit both of our communities." As they prepared for what would likely be their last night sharing the cabin, both Samuel and Jennifer felt that they were ending one chapter of their lives and beginning another. The storm had brought them together by chance, but their conversations and shared experiences had created a connection that would endure long after they parted ways. The fourth morning dawned clear and still, with brilliant sunshine reflecting off the pristine snow that covered the landscape. The temperature had risen to a more manageable 15 degrees below zero, and Samuel determined that it was safe to attempt the journey to town. He spent the early morning hours preparing his old pickup truck, checking the engine, tire chains, and emergency supplies they would need for the potentially treacherous drive down the mountain. Jennifer helped him load her belongings and the few salvageable items from her damaged car. Samuel had hiked down to the crash site the previous evening and determined that the vehicle was indeed totaled, but he had managed to retrieve her suitcase, purse, and some Christmas presents that had survived the impact. Looking at the crumpled car buried in snow, both of them were soberly reminded of how close Jennifer had come to dying in that frozen wasteland. "I still can't believe you saw me from so far away," Jennifer said as they drove carefully down the winding mountain road. "If you hadn't been outside splitting wood at exactly the right moment, I would have died in that car and no one would have found me until spring." Samuel navigated a particularly sharp turn before responding. "My grandmother used to say that there are no coincidences, only the Creator's plan unfolding in ways we don't always understand. Maybe I was meant to be outside at that moment. Maybe you were meant to take that road despite the danger. Maybe this whole experience was meant to teach us both something important." The drive to town took nearly 3 hours, as Samuel had to navigate around fallen trees and deep snowdrifts that blocked sections of the road. When they finally reached the main highway, they were both relieved to see that snowplows had been working to keep the major routes passable. The return to civilization felt surreal after their days of isolation in the mountains. Their first stop was the local sheriff's office, where Jennifer needed to file a report about her accident and arrange for her car to be towed. The deputy who took their statement was amazed by their story, commenting that he had seen many tourists make poor decisions in mountain weather, but few were lucky enough to be rescued by someone with Samuel's wilderness skills and knowledge. "You folks were incredibly fortunate," the deputy said. "We've already had 2 fatalities this winter from people getting stranded in weather like this. Mr. Yazzie, what you did took real courage. Most people wouldn't have risked their own safety to help a stranger." After completing the paperwork, Samuel and Jennifer drove to the small Apache Cultural Center, where Samuel had volunteered years earlier. The director, Maria Santos, was an old friend who had known Samuel since childhood. She was delighted to see him and intrigued to meet Jennifer, especially when she learned about Jennifer's work as a teacher and her interest in developing cross-cultural education programs. "Samuel has been hiding his light under a bushel for too long," Maria said with a warm laugh. "He knows more about traditional Apache wilderness skills than almost anyone left in our community. But he's been keeping all that knowledge to himself up in the mountains." Samuel felt slightly embarrassed by Maria's praise, but Jennifer immediately seized on the opportunity. That's exactly what we've been talking about, she said excitedly. Samuel could teach so much to young people, both from Apache communities and from urban schools. We've been discussing the possibility of developing some kind of educational exchange program. Maria's eyes lit up with interest. We've been looking for ways to expand our educational outreach, especially to schools in Phoenix and Tucson. The state has been encouraging more cross-cultural programs, and there might be funding available for the kind of program you're describing. The three of them spent the next 2 hours discussing possibilities and sharing ideas. Samuel found himself increasingly excited about the prospect of returning to teaching, but this time on his own terms and with a focus on preserving and sharing traditional knowledge. Jennifer contributed insights about curriculum development and how to make such programs meet state educational standards while still maintaining their cultural authenticity. I think we should start with a pilot program, Jennifer suggested. Maybe bring a small group of my students up here for a week-long experience during spring break. Samuel could teach them basic wilderness survival skills, traditional crafts, and Apache history and philosophy. In exchange, maybe some of the young people from your community could visit our school in Phoenix to share their experiences and learn about urban life. Samuel was amazed by how quickly their casual conversations had evolved into concrete plans. I would need to brush up on my teaching skills, he said. It's been a long time since I worked with young people, and I want to make sure I do it right. That's what makes you the perfect person for this, Maria said. You understand the responsibility that comes with sharing traditional knowledge. Too many people want to turn our culture into entertainment, but you would approach it with the respect and seriousness it deserves. Later that afternoon, Samuel drove Jennifer to the bus station in Flagstaff, where she could catch a ride to her sister's house. The parting was emotional for both of them, as they had formed a deep friendship during their intense shared experience. They exchanged contact information and made firm commitments to stay in touch and work together on developing their educational ideas. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, Jennifer said as they waited for her bus to arrive. You didn't just save my life. You've given me a new perspective on what's possible when people from different backgrounds work together with respect and common purpose. Samuel felt tears in his eyes, something that hadn't happened in years. You've given me something too, he said. You've reminded me that isolation isn't strength and that my grandmother's teachings are meant to be shared, not hoarded. You've helped me find my way back to the community and to my purpose in life. 6 months later, Samuel was standing in front of a group of excited 8-year-olds from Jennifer's school, teaching them how to identify edible plants and build a fire without matches. The pilot program had been such a success that it was being expanded to include multiple schools and had received significant funding from the state education department. Samuel had moved back to the Apache community, where he lived in a small house near the cultural center and worked full-time developing and teaching the wilderness education curriculum. Jennifer visited regularly, bringing new groups of students and helping to document the traditional knowledge that Samuel was sharing. She had become something of an expert on Apache culture herself, and her enthusiasm for cross-cultural education had inspired several other teachers to develop similar programs with different tribal communities throughout Arizona. You know what the most amazing part of this story is? Jennifer said one evening as she and Samuel sat around a campfire with a group of students who were about to complete their week-long wilderness experience. If my GPS hadn't malfunctioned and sent me down that dangerous road, none of this would have happened. We never would have met, and all these kids never would have had these incredible learning experiences. Samuel smiled as he watched the young faces illuminated by the firelight, listening intently, as one of the Apache teenagers told a traditional story about the relationship between humans and nature. My grandmother always said that everything happens for a reason, he said. Sometimes the Creator uses even our mistakes and difficulties to bring about something good. The important thing is to be open to the lessons and opportunities that come our way, even when they arrive in unexpected packages. The temperature that night dropped to just above freezing, nothing like the deadly cold that had brought Samuel and Jennifer together. But as Samuel looked up at the star-filled sky and listened to the voices of young people learning and sharing across cultural boundaries, he felt the same warmth in his heart that he had experienced during those difficult days in his mountain cabin. He had chosen compassion over pride, connection over isolation, and in doing so had discovered that the greatest adventures and the most Meaningful work often begins with a simple decision to help another human being in need. The Apache way of NDBATE had not only saved Jennifer's life but had transformed both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined when Samuel first spotted her stranded car in the snow. Their story had become part of the oral tradition that Samuel now shared with his students, a reminder that acts of kindness and courage can create ripples that extend far beyond the original moment of crisis, touching lives and communities in ways that honor the best of human nature.